Mao was a revolutionary, nationalist, and communist leader dedicated to overthrowing what was then the Chinese rule, pre-communist, until he would achieve the goal of a communist China. And they finally succeeded after a decades-long civil war. And so the Mao that arrives in national power in 1949 is a product of this very bloody period. And I think what happens with Mao is that unlike a lot of other leaders who, when they become national leaders, go through a period of calming down, where they understand that now their role is different. Mm-hmm. It's not a revolutionary role, it's a national role. He never really calmed down. He never stopped being what he considered to be a revolutionary leader, and so he continued to conduct revolutions, even though he was in power.
People have a perception that to be a leader, you need to be of impeccable character. But when you look at his personal life with the concubines and everything, do you think that you see a kind of dichotomy?
I think that for most people, the fact that Mao had that kind of personal life with the concubines and everything else, it was seen as, you know, one of the perks of being an authoritarian ruler of that sort. Remember, China was not a democratic country. They had emperors, they had authoritarian leaders. So it wasn't that the people found this outrageous. I think people like that. They bought into Mao, the mystique of Mao, the power of Mao, almost as a godlike figure. And even today, the image of Mao is still revered in a godlike way.
Authoritarian leaders, do you think that as soon as they start feeling like they are losing power or they can't cling to power anymore, that is when they turn from being an authoritarian leader to a dictator?
So yes, I believe that authoritarians and dictators never willingly give up power. And we see in history over and over again that the more power that you give them, the more they want.
You have heard of Maoism, but do you know what kind of leader Mao was? I'm right now in China, and in this segment called Understanding China Better, we're looking at different aspects of China, and one of the major aspects was the cultural revolution that the country had to go through. The Cultural Revolution was the brainchild of Mao, but who was Mao? What made him to be the leader he became? And what kind of things shaped him? To talk about this, I have with me Professor Moshik Temkin, a historian, somebody who teaches history at Harvard School and many other universities across the globe. So Professor Moshik, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
When you started researching, what was your first impression of Mao?
My first impression of Mao was that this was a very ruthless, committed, and charismatic revolutionary leader. And I don't think that one can understand China today, and certainly Chinese history in the past even 100 years, without understanding Mao, because he's extremely important. And even today in China, everyone has heard his name. Every child grows up learning about him.
His ideology, Maoism, has spread across the world and is not just restricted to China at this point. But who was Mao? What shaped him to be the person he became?
He came of age in the very early part of the 20th century, and he experienced imperial China, which was under colonial control of basically all the colonial powers, turning China into what they called spheres of influence. And as a backlash to this kind of colonial control of China, which was increasingly weak and humiliated, there was a wave of nationalism. A backlash, if you will, to this kind of humiliation. And Mao actually grew up in that wave of nationalism. He started out in the May 4th movement of 1919. This is after World War I. And he combined a kind of Chinese nationalistic pride with communist principles. So he was inspired by Marxism, and he was inspired by the Russian Revolution that had taken place in 1917. And although Marxist revolutions were supposed to happen in industrial advanced societies according to Marxist theory, the Bolshevik revolution in Russia showed Mao actually that a communist revolution could take place, a successful one, could take place in what was basically an agricultural, rural society as Russia was. And Mao, like others, began to think, hey, we could do the same thing. We could do the same thing in China. So basically, from that point on, Mao was a revolutionary, nationalist, and communist leader dedicated to overthrowing what was then the Chinese rule, pre-communist, until he would achieve the goal of a communist China. And they finally succeeded after a decades-long civil war. So really you have two Maos in history. You have the Mao who is the revolutionary leader of a civil war, trying to overthrow the government and taking over, turning China into a communist country. And then you have post-revolution Mao, who is the Mao as the national leader now of a communist China, the People's Republic of China, really from 1949 until his death in 1976.
To understand his level of influence, do you think because like he rose from a grassroots leader and then became a national leader, and that is one of the reasons why so many people idolize him? Or do you think that it is also part of a carefully calculated plan in which he ensured that everybody knew who Mao Zedong was, everybody knew what his thoughts were?
In history, there is a very small, select handful group of leaders across the world who are truly transformational. And they can be the leaders of a national revolution. They can be people who change the world. In India, you could throw out a few names, but one name that will often come up is the Mahatma Gandhi. Every Indian person will know who that was. This is a national iconic figure. Can be debated a little bit, but really is kind of across the board a major figure. So equivalent to that, if you will, I think in China, although very different kind of leader and person, is Mao, because Mao is really the man most responsible for turning China into really what it is today. So I think that's one very important element. It's a simple fact of his importance. The second is that, yes, Mao is considered to be a people's leader, and that he came from the grassroots. The communist revolution itself was very much seen as a grassroots revolution against these very corrupt and weak elites that were not serving what he considered to be the national interest. And China of today is still, at least officially, a communist country dedicated to the principles that Mao set out originally many, many decades ago.
But when you talk about his ideology, how do you differentiate it from the original Marxism or Leninism or Stalinism or other types of like communism and socialism?
Well, it's differentiated in the main sense that Mao was Chinese. And so he was aware that China is a different country from, let's say, Germany, where Marx himself was originally from, and Engels, the other Marxist theorist, was originally from. It's also a different country from Russia, which is where Lenin, who was Mao's first inspiration, was from, or Stalin, the Soviet dictator. And so I think we have to understand Mao as a Marxist, as a communist, but as someone who was also a Chinese nationalist and understood the Chinese history, the Chinese public in a distinctive way. So that's a little bit how communist revolutions work. If they're successful in history, it's because they adapted to local and national circumstances that change from country to country. And so I think ideologically, Mao was similar to, let's say, a Lenin, who was the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution. But he was different in that he considered himself first and foremost a leader of China and the Chinese people.
They say power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Do you think that is what happened after Mao did become the national leader, and then he had to transform this country into, according to his ideals? That's where you have the Great Leap Forward, that's where you have the attempts at industrializing China, and that's where you have the Great Famine.
That's a very important point. We have to distinguish, as I said earlier, between the Mao of the revolutionary period, so Mao as the leader of the communist side in the civil war in China, that really was important in the 1930s and in the 1940s. And it's very important to remember that this is also the period in which we are talking about World War II. And this is when Japan has invaded and occupied China. And so there is a civil war happening between the communists and the nationalists in China on the one hand, and there's also a national war happening against Japan on the other side. And so Mao is really a leader in this period, in this war, and these are his formative years as a young leader. And these are brutal, ruthless, violent years. The atrocities that took place in China are basically indescribable. And we're really talking about one of the worst moments not just in Chinese history, but in terms of world history, in terms of what happened. And so we have to understand Mao's leadership also as a product of this very violent era in which he himself felt that only sheer ruthlessness and power could win the day. And so the Mao that arrives in national power in 1949 is a product of this very bloody period. And I think what happens with Mao is that unlike a lot of other leaders who, when they become national leaders, go through a period of calming down, where they understand that now their role is different. Mm-hmm. It's not a revolutionary role, it's a national role. He never really calmed down. He never stopped being what he considered to be a revolutionary leader. And so he continued to conduct revolutions, even though he was in power. So you mentioned the Great Leap Forward. That is one of really the worst moments, because what they were doing is they were trying to emulate the Soviet Union, which also had plans of this sort. But it was a disastrous plan to completely transform and industrialize Chinese society. It was not only a failure, but it wound up killing millions of people in famines, in terrible disease and situations that happened in the late 50s and early 60s. And then afterwards, even as the Chinese people have not yet recovered from that, he launches as a national leader basically in his old age now. He launches what he called the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, which was another attempt to transform Chinese society, and also is seen as largely very disastrous for many people in China.
Most leaders, when they rise to national power, then choose to maintain that status quo and push for like peace in the country later on. That's why you see many countries who were previously colonized, then later becoming like an oppressing state regime. But in case of Mao, you see a completely different dynamics in which, despite becoming a national leader, he was always pushing for more and more revolutions. Do you think that was because he wanted to leave a legacy behind as a revolutionary leader, or did he actually believe that you can never stop revolutions from happening if you want the country to keep progressing? Or what were the key drivers behind that kind of approach?
That's a good question. I think it's a combination of things. I think for one thing, it's ideological. So I believe that Mao was a committed ideological communist revolutionary. Why do I say that? Because a lot of people call themselves communists or are called communists, but I, as a historian, don't really consider them communists or even Marxist. That is often used as a label, either to promote or to denigrate, or to even scare people. Whereas I think Mao really was an authentic communist revolutionary. And so as such, he believed in what he considered to be a classless society. He also believed in a permanent revolution. So he thought that communism was in itself a revolutionary ideology. Even if you win power, it doesn't mean that you stop being revolutionary. You're always seeking to further the revolution, continue the revolution, deepen the revolution. It's not just a matter of obtaining the regime and then stopping. You continue to build that classless society. And so there's an ideological component to what he was doing. The second, I think, is a personal and more cynical component, which is that the Cultural Revolution was his bid to cling to power. He was already on his way out. After the famine, the Great Leap Forward, he was really seen as discredited in many ways, because it had been such a disaster. And so many people had died, that some of his the people around him, including Zhou Enlai and other Chinese leaders, were saying to him, look, you'll still nominally stay the leader. You can go home and be with, your concubines and just relax. And we'll manage the country and try to bring things back to stability. And I think for a while Mao tried that, but he was just too restless, too attached to power. And he came back with a vengeance. And that's really the launching of the Cultural Revolution. So it was in some ways a personal attempt, a successful one, to rid the country of all his rivals, all his enemies, all the people who would challenge his power. So he was also a very authoritarian, very ruthless leader. And then I think the third component was this sense that for Mao, I don't think that he was cut out to be a national leader. I think he was cut out to be a revolutionary leader. I think as a revolutionary leader, and by that I mean a person who is leading a real revolution from below against the powers that be, as such he was really in his element. This is where he shined, as it were. This is where he achieved his greatest successes. This is where he became a national hero. And that's Mao, the revolutionary leader. But then Mao...
Do you think if he had stayed like away from the state apparatus and kept continuing the revolution from outside the state apparatus, it would be like a completely different scenario for China?
Well, I don't think he would have stayed outside and continued the revolutionary apparatus. I think ideally what would have happened is that once they were in power, he might have turned power over to people who were suited for governance, people who were suited for national governance. Because now you have power, but what are you going to do with the power? You have to develop the country. China was a desperately poor country. And it was a desperately poor country when Mao died. So he didn't change that at all. So I think the problem here is that we're talking about someone who is really good at being a revolutionary leader, but a disaster at being a national leader. It's not always the same. Some people are really good at staging revolutions, but they're not good at governing. And some people are really governing, but they're terrible at staging revolutions. I think Mao was doing both of those things. And that's why I think you have a pre-communist China Mao and then a post-communist China Mao. And that's why we're really talking about two different Maos. It's the same person, but the circumstances are completely different, and China needed very different things.
You mentioned the concubines, and generally people have a perception that to be a leader, you need to be of impeccable character, because to rally people behind you, you need to demonstrate those characteristics of integrity, and you're somebody that people can rely on. But when you look at his personal life with the concubines and everything, do you think that you see a kind of dichotomy, or that was a part of his life that is generally accepted by people as like, we don't need to intervene in this?
Yes, so I recommend not hero worshipping anyone in history or in the present. You would be hard-pressed to truly find any leader, especially a major leader, without peccadillos in their personal life, or to look for someone with impeccable character. I personally have never met someone who is perfect. I think that for most people, the fact that Mao had that kind of personal life with the concubines and everything else, it was seen as, one of the perks of being an authoritarian ruler of that sort. Remember, China was not a democratic country. They had emperors, they had authoritarian leaders. So it wasn't that the people found this outrageous. Mm-hmm. I think for the people, it mattered more what Mao or any other leader was doing for them and their lives. You see that even today, where the public will often overlook things that leaders do on a personal basis, because what they're really looking for is the connection with the leader and the results that they feel that the leader is providing them and their society. So I think with Mao we have the same effect. And I also think that in other ways, this lifestyle and the fact that Mao projected such mystique around himself. There's another element of Mao which is almost spiritual, the quotes and the little red book that children were supposed to memorize. And Mao really was a very wise person in a way, very smart in other ways. He wasn't particularly sophisticated as an intellectual, but he did have some very profound notions about how to connect with people. And that, I think, was the source of his strength. So I think people like that. They bought into Mao, the mystique of Mao, the power of Mao, almost as a godlike figure. And even today, the image of Mao is still revered in a godlike way. So we have to look at Mao really to understand how powerful his image is, and the worshipping of Mao. So concubines is it's just is a part of that. In China today, you'll see Mao's image everywhere, despite everything that happened, and everything that people went through under his tenure as leader. There is still a sense that Mao was almost like a god.
You see that exact trend being replicated by many authoritarian leaders even today, in which they try to ensure that their image and their words reach out to every single person in their country so they can maintain that kind of persona. Authoritarian leaders, do you think that as soon as they start feeling like they are losing power or they can't cling to power anymore, that is when they turn from being an authoritarian leader to a dictator?
Well, I'm not sure where the line crosses actually from being an authoritarian leader to a dictator.
We had Indira Gandhi and a similar kind of dynamic at some point.
Yes, I think so with Indira Gandhi, if that's interesting, I think with her actually what we see is the turn from a democratic leader to an authoritarian leader. Although as historians like myself, we also understand that very often, even today, democracy is mixed with authoritarianism in many countries. And I don't think I have to mention names of countries, but this is a very common phenomenon where a leader is maybe elected democratically, enjoy widespread support, and there is even a media and television, free press, more or less, but the leader displays authoritarian tendencies and even policies. This happens in Europe, it happens in Latin America, it happens in South Asia, it happens in the Middle East and many other places. I think the lesson with Mao is that, yes, a truly authoritarian dictatorial leader, and Mao was certainly one of these, even though the language that he used was always very democratic, egalitarian language. So he was saying during the Cultural Revolution over and over again, look, we have to overthrow the power. We have to fight the people at the top. But it was very odd because he was at the top of the top. So it was almost like someone at the very top launching a revolution against those just under him. And the goal, I think, was, as I said before, partly also to cling to power. So yes, I believe that authoritarians and dictators never willingly give up power. And we see in history over and over again that the more power that you give them, the more they want. And in history also shows us that sometimes the only ways that you can get rid of authoritarian dictatorial power is either they die, which is what happened with Mao eventually, or you have to dislodge them by force. That also happens. And in fact, Mao understood that with China's previous rulers, right? So I think that is one thing we have to take into account. And with Mao, it was a case of, even today, China is a very different place in 2024 from what it was in 1966 or 1976 when Mao was having the Cultural Revolution. But it does have a lot of things in common. It is still an authoritarian country. It is still a communist country. And it still upholds, at least on paper, in theory, it upholds the same principles that Mao upheld. They have never really renounced anything significant that Mao said about China.